Hello everyone! Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. Exit 127, The Road That Refuses. From Marcus Chen. The headlights of my Peterbilt cut through the Nevada darkness like twin searchlights, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional tumble of sagebrush dancing across the highway. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, and my body was starting to feel every mile in my bones. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a weary green, 2:47 a.m. Even the night seemed tired at this hour, hanging heavy and still over the desert like a blanket that had forgotten how to breathe. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts trying to remember how to speak. Static filled the spaces between their words, creating an odd rhythm that matched the steady thrum of my engine. I reached for my thermos of coffee, now cold and bitter, but it was fuel nonetheless. The caffeine hit my system with all the enthusiasm of a dying battery, barely enough to keep my eyes focused on the road ahead. That's when I saw the sign for Exit 127, its reflective surface catching my headlights and throwing the light back at me in a way that made me blink twice. Strange, I thought, because I'd driven this stretch of Interstate 80 more times than I could count over the past 8 years, and I could have sworn there had never been an exit here before. The sign was clean and new, its white lettering sharp against the green background. Exit 127, services 1 mile. Below it, smaller text promised gas, food, and lodging, the holy trinity of truck stop amenities. My fuel gauge showed just under a quarter tank, enough to make it to my usual stop in Elko. But the promise of an earlier rest was tempting. My back ached from the seat, my eyes burned from staring into the darkness, and my stomach had been growling for the past hour with increasing urgency. I found myself easing off the accelerator slightly, letting the big rig slow as I considered my options. The desert around me remained utterly silent except for the whisper of wind across my cab and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. Another sign appeared in my headlights. Exit 127, services 1 to 2 mile. The lettering seemed even brighter this time, almost eager. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only the familiar blue line of the highway stretching endlessly forward, with no indication of any upcoming exits. Technology could be unreliable out here in the middle of nowhere, I reasoned. Satellites sometimes lost their way in all this emptiness, and GPS units were notorious for missing newly constructed interchanges. The third sign should have appeared within minutes, but as I continued down the highway, maintaining my reduced speed and watching carefully, nothing materialized in the cone of my headlights. The mile marker I passed confirmed I'd traveled the distance, but there was no Exit 127 services next right sign, no off-ramp, no hint that civilization existed anywhere beyond the narrow ribbon of highway beneath my wheels. I felt a peculiar twist in my stomach, part disappointment and part something else I couldn't quite name. I pressed the accelerator and brought my speed back up to cruising level, dismissing the incident as a trick of tired eyes and wishful thinking. But then 10 minutes later I saw the first sign again. Exit 127 services 1 mile. The exact same sign in the exact same spot, looking exactly as new and promising as it had before. This time I was certain of the mile marker number when I passed it, certain of the distinctive rock formation off to my right that looked like a sleeping giant's profile against the star-scattered sky. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar texture of the worn leather suddenly feeling foreign under my palms. I had definitely passed this sign before, I was absolutely sure of it, but here it was again, reflecting my headlights with that same eager gleam. I glanced at my speedometer to confirm I hadn't somehow been driving in reverse, saw the steady forward progress of the landscape outside my windows, noted the consistent direction of the wind across my cab. This time I paid closer attention, watching my odometer as I drove, counting the tenths of miles as they clicked past. At exactly 9/10 of a mile from the first sign, I began looking for the second. My headlights swept the roadside, searching for that familiar green and white rectangle, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light without giving anything back. No second sign appeared. No half-mile warning. No indication that exit 127 existed anywhere but in that single, impossible announcement. When I reached what should have been the exit itself, I slowed to nearly 40 miles per hour, scanning both sides of the highway with growing unease. There was nothing but desert, the same endless expanse of scrub brush and distant mountains that had been my companion for hundreds of miles. No off-ramp, no truck stop, no buildings or lights or any sign of human presence. Just the highway stretching ahead into darkness and the vast emptiness of Nevada night, pressing in around my cab like something with intention. My CB radio suddenly burst to life with a clarity that made me jump. "Hey there, eastbound Peterbilt, you looking for that exit?" The voice was clear and friendly, tinged with the easy familiarity of the trucking community, but I couldn't see any other vehicles on the road in either direction. My mirrors showed only darkness, and the highway ahead remained empty. I keyed the microphone with a hand that trembled slightly. "This is eastbound Peterbilt, go ahead." My voice sounded strange in the confines of my cab, smaller somehow than usual. "Exit 127, right? We got fuel at 99 cents a gallon, hot food, clean showers. You just keep driving, friend. You'll see the sign real soon." I wanted to ask who was speaking, where they were broadcasting from, how they knew I was looking for an exit that didn't seem to exist. But before I could key the microphone again, the radio dissolved back into static. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Sure enough, the sign appeared again in my headlights. Exit 127 services 1 mile. This was the third time now. I was certain of it, and my certainty brought with it a cold knot of fear that settled in my chest like a stone. I checked my fuel gauge and saw it had dropped to just under 1/8 of a tank, far lower than it should have been given the distance I'd traveled. Time seemed to be moving strangely too. My dashboard clock showed 2:52 a.m., only 5 minutes later than when I'd first noticed the sign, despite the fact that I'd been driving for what felt like 20 or 30 minutes. This time I decided to follow through, to push past whatever force was preventing me from reaching this phantom exit. I maintained my speed carefully, watching the odometer, noting every landmark as I passed. The sleeping giant rock formation, a cluster of Joshua trees that looked like dancers frozen in celebration, a small wash that cut under the highway through a concrete culvert. At the half-mile point, I began looking for the second sign, and this time I was ready when it didn't appear. Instead, something else caught my attention. Off to my right, barely visible in the darkness beyond my headlights' reach, I could see lights. Warm yellow lights that flickered like flames or old-fashioned light bulbs, arranged in what might have been the outline of buildings. As I drove past, straining to see more clearly, I caught a glimpse of what looked like gas pumps, their shapes familiar and welcoming, and beyond them the squat silhouette of a diner or truck stop. But there was no exit, no way to reach those tantalizing lights. The highway continued straight ahead, separated from the mirage by what seemed like miles of empty desert, though the lights appeared close enough to walk to in minutes. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate now to put distance between myself and whatever impossible thing was happening in this stretch of Nevada nowhere. My fuel gauge dropped another notch, and a warning light began flashing on my dashboard. The engine's rhythm seemed less steady now, occasional hiccups in its breathing that made my stomach clench with new anxiety. I needed fuel, needed it badly, but Elko was still 40 miles ahead and I wasn't certain I could make it. The very real possibility of being stranded in this place where exits appeared and disappeared like mirages made my mouth go dry. The CB crackled again. "Still looking for that exit, eastbound Peterbilt? We're right here waiting for you. Just keep driving, friend. Keep driving and you'll find us." But this time there was something different in the voice, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded hollow, like an echo of an echo, and underneath the words I could hear what might have been wind or breathing, or the whisper of sand against metal, the harmony of Highway 39. From Marcus, the diesel engine of my Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar lullaby as I navigated the winding curves of Highway 39. Somewhere deep in the mountains of West Virginia, rain drummed steadily against the windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the darkness. It was well past midnight, and the CB radio had been silent for the better part of 2 hours, leaving me alone with nothing but the rhythm of wipers and the distant rumble of thunder echoing through the hollows. I had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook because the delivery in Charleston couldn't wait until morning. My eyes burned with fatigue and my shoulders ached from gripping the wheel through the mountain passes. The coffee from my last stop had long since worn off, leaving behind only the metallic taste of exhaustion and the growing weight of sleep pressing down on my eyelids. When I spotted the faded blue sign announcing a rest area in 2 miles, I felt a wave of relief wash over me like warm water. The rest stop materialized through the rain like something from a half-remembered dream, its single overhead light casting a pale circle of illumination across cracked asphalt and weather-beaten picnic tables. A small brick building squatted at the far end of the lot, its windows dark except for the sickly green glow of an exit sign barely visible through the glass. I pulled the rig into the truck parking area, the air brakes hissing their satisfaction as I finally came to a complete stop for the first time in hours. As I shut down the engine, the sudden silence felt almost oppressive after so many hours of constant noise. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the cab roof, but underneath that familiar sound I became aware of something else. Something that made me pause with my hand halfway to the door handle. It was subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the wind moving through the trees that surrounded the rest stop. But as I listened more carefully, the sound began to take shape and form. Singing, voices raised in harmony, drifting across the parking lot like smoke. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a slow and mournful tune that seemed to wrap around the raindrops and flow through the darkness with an almost liquid quality. I couldn't make out the words, but the voices blended together in perfect unity, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in my ears but somewhere deeper. In the very center of my chest, I stepped down from the cab, my boots splashing in shallow puddles as I tried to determine where the singing was coming from. The sound seemed to be emanating from the direction of the rest stop building, but as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't coming from inside the structure at all. Instead, the voices appeared to be drifting from somewhere beyond the building, perhaps from the wooded area that stretched away into the darkness behind the facilities. The melody continued, never seeming to pause for breath or break for a new verse. It simply flowed onward like a river, carrying with it an emotional weight that I couldn't quite identify. There was something deeply sorrowful about the music, yet also strangely comforting, as if the voices were offering solace for some ancient grief that had been carved into the very landscape of this place. I found myself walking toward the sound without conscious decision, drawn by the ethereal beauty of the harmonies and the almost hypnotic quality of their endless repetition. The gravel beneath my feet crunched softly with each step, and the rain continued to fall in steady sheets, but neither sound seemed able to penetrate the sphere of influence that the singing had created around this small patch of mountain wilderness. As I rounded the corner of the building, I expected to find a group of people gathered perhaps around a campfire or in some kind of outdoor pavilion. But the area behind the rest stop was empty, except for a few more picnic tables and a collection of rusted trash receptacles. The singing continued, but now it seemed to be coming from even further back, from within the dense stand of pine and oak trees that formed a natural wall between the rest area and whatever lay beyond in the deeper woods. I paused at the edge of the tree line, suddenly aware of how far I had wandered from my truck and how isolated this place truly was. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back down the mountain, and I hadn't seen another vehicle on the highway for the better part of an hour before stopping. Yet the voices continued their ethereal performance, and despite a growing sense of unease, I found myself unable to turn away from the mystery they represented. The first few steps into the woods were tentative, my hands extended in front of me to push aside low-hanging branches that dripped steadily with accumulated rain. The singing grew clearer as I moved deeper into the trees, and I began to realize that what I was hearing was far more complex than I had initially understood. There weren't just 4 or 5 voices creating these harmonies, but dozens, perhaps even more, all blending together in a tapestry of sound that seemed to fill every space between the trees. The melody itself began to take on a more distinct character as I drew closer to its source. It was definitely a hymn of some kind, though not one I recognized from my childhood growing up in rural Methodist churches. The tune had an older quality to it, something that spoke of traditions that reached back generations, of communities that had sung these same songs around kitchen tables and at gravesides for longer than anyone could remember. Then, through a gap in the trees ahead, I saw them. They stood in a natural clearing perhaps 50 yards across, arranged in neat rows like a traditional church choir. But even in the dim light filtering down through the canopy, I could see that something was profoundly wrong with this gathering. The figures were translucent, their forms wavering slightly as if seen through heat shimmer or disturbed water. They wore clothing from another era, simple dresses and dark suits that might have been fashionable 60 or 70 years ago. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization with the music that filled the air, but their eyes remained closed, and their faces bore expressions of such profound sadness that I felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They swayed gently as they sang, their translucent forms moving with the rhythm of their eternal hymn, and I realized with growing horror that I was looking at the ghosts of an entire church congregation. As I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, one of the figures in the front row slowly opened her eyes and looked directly at me. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pinned back in an old-fashioned style, and when our gazes met, her expression changed from sorrowful reverence to something that might have been hope, or perhaps desperate need. She raised one translucent hand and beckoned to me, her mouth still moving with the words of the hymn, and I heard her voice rise above the others for just a moment, calling out in a wavering soprano that seemed to pierce straight through my soul. The other members of the ghostly choir began to turn toward me. Then, their eyes opening one by one like flowers blooming in reverse time. Each face that looked in my direction bore the same expression of longing and need, and I understood with crystalline clarity that they wanted me to join them, to add my voice to their eternal song and become part of whatever tragedy had bound them to this isolated clearing in the mountains of West Virginia. I took a step backward, then another, as more and more of the spectral singers turned their attention toward me. The hymn continued without pause, but now it seemed to carry an undertone of urgency, as if the choir was trying to communicate something vital through their music, some message that could only be conveyed through the ancient language of harmony and shared breath. My retreat became more urgent as the entire congregation began to move toward me, their translucent forms gliding across the forest floor without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf. They maintained their perfect formation even as they advanced, their voices never faltering in their haunting melody, and I realized that they had been waiting in this clearing for decades, perhaps longer, for someone to complete their number and allow them to finish whatever spiritual work they had left undone. I turned and ran then, crashing through the underbrush with abandon, branches tearing at my jacket and face as I fought my way back toward the rest stop and the solid reality of my truck. Behind me, the singing grew louder and more insistent, as if the entire choir was following in my wake, their ghostly voices calling out across the darkness for me to return and take my place among their ranks. I burst from the tree line at a full sprint, my lungs burning and my heart hammering against my ribs as I raced across the wet parking lot toward my Peterbilt. The singing continued behind me, but it was beginning to fade now, returning to its original distant quality as I put more space between myself and the supernatural congregation. I reached the truck and hauled myself up into the cab, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the ignition and brought the diesel engine roaring back to life. As I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto Highway 39, I glanced in my mirrors one last time and saw them standing at the edge. The Resonance Road. From Marcus Chen, the stretch of Highway 49 between Millerville and Cedar Point had always been my least favorite run. Not because of the winding mountain curves or the way fog rolled down from the peaks like ghostly fingers, but because of the sounds. Every trucker who'd driven that route knew about the sounds, though most of us had learned not to talk about them at truck stops or over the CB radio. Some things were better left unspoken, filed away in the part of your mind where you keep the experiences that don't quite fit into the normal world. I'd been hauling freight along that route for the better part of 15 years, and the hollow sounds had been there from my very first run. At first, I'd attributed them to echo effects from the canyon walls that flanked the highway. The way my diesel engine's rumble seemed to bounce back strangely, creating phantom harmonics that didn't belong to any mechanical system I understood. The sound would come and go, usually in the dead zones between radio stations, when the only company I had was the steady thrum of my 18 wheels on weathered asphalt, and the occasional whisper of wind through my cab's weather stripping. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the hollow sounds were stronger, more persistent, and they seemed to be responding to something I couldn't identify. I'd started my run just after midnight, my Peterbilt's headlights cutting through a light drizzle that had been falling since Sacramento. The weather forecast had called for clear skies, but mountain weather had its own rules, and I'd learned long ago to trust my windshield over any meteorologist's predictions. The first hint that something was off came around mile marker 127, where the highway begins its gentle descent toward the valley floor. I was maintaining a steady 55, my engine purring with the satisfied hum of a well-maintained machine, when I heard it, that familiar hollow note that seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath the road itself. But this time, instead of the usual brief echo that would fade after a few seconds, the sound lingered, growing stronger, developing harmonics that made my teeth ache and caused my coffee to vibrate in tiny ripples across its surface. I reached for my CB radio, thinking maybe I'd check in with other drivers, see if anyone else was experiencing anything unusual, but the radio produced only static, the kind of white noise that sounds almost like voices if you listen too carefully. I clicked through the channels, searching for even a distant conversation, but found nothing except that persistent static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the hollow sounds coming from below. The rain began to fall harder, droplets striking my windshield with increasing urgency, and I activated my wipers, their steady back-and-forth rhythm creating a counterpoint to the strange resonance that now seemed to be coming from all directions. My headlights illuminated the wet asphalt ahead, revealing the familiar yellow lines and reflective markers that had guided me through countless nights. But tonight they seemed somehow different, as if they were marking a path to somewhere I'd never been, despite having driven this route hundreds of times. Around mile marker 119, I noticed that my engine's sound had changed subtly, not in any way that suggested mechanical problems, but as if it were harmonizing with whatever was producing those hollow notes. The usual diesel rumble had acquired an additional layer, a deeper resonance that I could feel in my chest as much as hear with my ears. I checked my gauges, but everything appeared normal. Oil pressure steady, temperature in the green, RPMs exactly where they should be for my current speed and load. That's when I saw the lights in my mirrors, not the familiar white and red of another truck's headlights and tail lights, but something else entirely. A soft blue glow that seemed to emanate from the road surface itself. I adjusted my side mirror, trying to get a better look, but the lights remained elusive, always seeming to be just beyond the reach of direct observation, visible only in my peripheral vision or reflected surfaces. The hollow sounds grew stronger as I continued my descent, and I began to realize they weren't random acoustic phenomena, but seemed to follow a pattern, rising and falling in waves that corresponded to something I couldn't identify. I found myself unconsciously adjusting my speed to match the rhythm, slowing during the quieter moments and accelerating when the resonance peaked, as if my truck had become part of some vast, invisible orchestra performing a composition written in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to fully comprehend. By mile marker 113, the pattern had become unmistakable, and with growing unease, I realized the sounds were matching my heartbeat, not my current heart rate, but something deeper and slower, as if they were synchronized with some fundamental rhythm that existed beneath conscious awareness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to maintain focus on the road ahead, but the blue lights in my mirrors had grown brighter, and I could see them now without looking directly. A soft luminescence that seemed to be keeping pace with my truck, despite my varying speed. The rain had intensified into a steady downpour, and my wipers were struggling to keep up with the deluge. Through the distorted view of water-streaked glass, the familiar landscape of Highway 49 began to look strange and unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it for the first time, or viewing it through some filter that revealed hidden aspects normally invisible to travelers. The trees lining the roadway appeared taller and more densely packed than I remembered, their branches reaching across the highway like gnarled fingers, trying to touch something just beyond their grasp. It was then that I noticed my speedometer needle was moving, independently of my foot pressure on the accelerator. Despite maintaining steady pressure on the pedal, my speed was fluctuating in harmony with the hollow sounds, accelerating during the peaks and slowing during the valleys, as if my truck were responding to commands from some external source. I tried to override the effect by deliberately changing my pedal pressure, but my truck seemed determined to maintain its synchronization with the mysterious rhythm. The blue lights had grown bright enough now that they were reflecting off my wet windshield, creating patterns of shifting luminescence that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. I could see them clearly in all my mirrors, not behind me as I had initially thought, but somehow underneath my trailer, as if the light were emanating from the road surface directly beneath my wheels. The hollow sounds had evolved into something more complex, layers of resonance that seemed to be commenting on my presence, acknowledging my participation in whatever phenomenon was occurring along this stretch of highway. As I approached mile marker 108, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another truck was ahead of me, barely visible through the rain and darkness, but clearly there, its taillights cutting through the gloom like red eyes. The strange thing was, I hadn't seen any headlights approaching in the opposite direction, and there had been no truck ahead of me when I'd last checked my forward view just moments earlier. This truck seemed to have simply materialized out of the storm, and as I watched, I realized it was maintaining exactly the same fluctuating speed as my own vehicle, accelerating and slowing in perfect synchronization with the hollow sounds. I tried to radio the other driver, clicking through channels and calling out on the emergency frequency, but my radio continued to produce only that rhythmic static that seemed to pulse in harmony with my heartbeat and the mysterious sounds from below. The blue lights beneath my truck had grown so bright now that they were illuminating the rain itself, creating pillars of luminescent droplets that stretched from the road surface to the low-hanging clouds above. That's when I realized the other truck wasn't casting any light ahead of itself. Despite clearly having taillights, there were no headlights visible, no beam cutting through the darkness ahead of its position. It was as if the vehicle were somehow traveling backward, or perhaps existing in some state where forward and backward had lost their meaning. The hollow sounds reached a crescendo as this understanding hit me, and I felt my truck beginning to accelerate beyond any speed I would normally attempt on this winding mountain highway. My engine was running smoothly, but the sound it was making no longer resembled anything produced by pistons and cylinders. Instead, it had become part of the hollow resonance, adding its voice to a chorus that seemed to include the other truck, the road itself, and something vast and invisible that encompassed the entire valley below. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles as my speedometer needle swept past safe limits, but despite the increasing velocity, I felt no loss of control. No sense that my truck might leave the roadway or fail to navigate the curves ahead. The rain had become something beyond weather, a vertical river that transformed my windshield into a liquid lens that revealed glimpses of parallel highways, other versions of Route 49, where different trucks were making the same journey through the same supernatural symphony. In some of these glimpses, I could see myself from the outside, my Peterbilt glowing with the same blue luminescence that I'd been seeing beneath my trailer, part of a convoy of ghost trucks that stretched beyond the limits of vision in both directions. As I crested the final hill before the descent into Cedar Point, the hollow sounds reached a peak that was beyond hearing, a frequency that I felt in my bones rather than perceived with my ears, the melody that follows. From Marcus, I've been driving long haul for 23 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the highway could throw at me. Midnight fog that swallows your headlights whole, ice storms that turn the interstate into a skating rink, and those strange little desert towns where the locals watch you pump gas like you're some kind of curiosity. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada last autumn. It was late October when I picked up the load in Sacramento, bound for Denver. The dispatcher had warned me about construction delays, but the money was good, and I needed to make up for the work I'd missed when my rig was in the shop the month before. My Peterbilt was running smooth as silk after the repairs, her diesel engine purring with that deep, satisfied rumble that tells you everything's in perfect harmony under the hood. The trouble started around 4 in the afternoon, somewhere between Fernley and Fallon. I was making good time despite the construction zones, and the desert stretched out on both sides of the highway like a golden ocean frozen in time. That's when I first heard it, just barely audible over the sound of my own engine and the country station crackling through the radio. It was another truck somewhere behind me, its engine producing this low melodic hum that seemed almost musical in its consistency. At first I didn't think much of it. Every rig has its own signature sound, and some of the newer models run quieter than others. But as the miles rolled by, that humming grew more distinct, more deliberate somehow. It wasn't just the sound of a well-tuned engine anymore. It was something else entirely, like a lullaby being sung by machinery that had somehow learned to carry a tune. I checked my mirrors every few minutes, but the road behind me remained empty except for the occasional passenger car. The humming continued, though, steady and constant, rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed to match the rolling hills of the desert landscape. It was oddly soothing at first, almost hypnotic in the way it blended with the drone of my own tires on asphalt. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the humming grew stronger. I turned down my radio, then turned it off completely, but the sound persisted. It was definitely coming from outside my cab, from somewhere behind me on the highway. But every time I checked my mirrors, I saw only empty roads shimmering with heat mirages. The first real chill of unease crept up my spine when I realized the humming was getting closer. Not louder exactly, but more intimate somehow. As if whatever was producing that eerie melody was slowly gaining on me despite my steady 65 miles per hour. I pressed a little harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb to 70, then 75. But the humming kept pace effortlessly. That's when I saw it in my passenger side mirror, just as the sun touched the horizon and set the entire sky ablaze with orange and purple fire. It was a truck, all right, but unlike any big rig I'd ever seen on the road. The cab was sleek and rounded, almost organic in its curves, and the entire vehicle seemed to shimmer and waver as if it were made of liquid metal rather than steel and chrome. But the strangest thing of all was that it cast no shadow, even with the sun sitting low and harsh across the desert floor. The humming intensified as the ghostly truck pulled alongside me in the passing lane, and I could see now that the sound was indeed coming from this impossible vehicle. Its engine, if it had one, produced no visible exhaust, and its wheels seemed to barely touch the asphalt as it glided forward with an otherworldly grace. The cab windows were tinted so dark they appeared black, offering no glimpse of whoever or whatever might be driving. I tried to get a better look at the truck, leaning forward and squinting against the glare of the setting sun. But the harder I stared, the more elusive it became. It seemed to exist in my peripheral vision more than in direct sight, like those floaters you sometimes see drifting across your eyes when you're tired. But the humming was real enough, a deep, resonant melody that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. The phantom truck stayed beside me for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, its humming song growing more complex and haunting with each passing mile. I found myself listening to it despite my growing fear, trying to pick out familiar melodies in its alien harmonies. There were moments when it almost sounded like something I knew, a half-remembered lullaby from childhood, or a tune I'd heard on the radio years ago. But just as I thought I might recognize it, the melody would shift and become something else entirely. As full darkness began to settle over the desert, the humming truck started to pull ahead, but instead of simply overtaking me and disappearing down the highway as any normal vehicle would, it began to fade gradually, becoming more and more translucent with each passing second. I watched in fascination and growing terror as it became first a ghostly outline, then little more than a suggestion of movement in the gathering darkness. But the humming remained, growing fainter but never quite disappearing entirely. It followed me through the night, a constant companion that made sleep impossible during my mandatory rest breaks. Every time I thought it had finally faded away completely, there it would be again, soft and distant but unmistakably present, like a song playing in the next room of an empty house. I tried everything I could think of to escape that haunting melody. I took alternate routes, stopped at truck stops for extended breaks, even pulled off the highway completely and waited for hours in the parking lot of an abandoned gas station. But no matter what I did, when I got back on the road, the humming would return within minutes, patient and persistent and utterly inescapable. The worst part wasn't the fear, though that was certainly there. It was the way the humming began to affect my thoughts and dreams. During my brief, restless naps, I found myself dreaming of highways that stretched through landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth, of cargo loads that shifted and whispered in languages I didn't understand, of destinations that appeared on no map, but seemed more real than the cities I'd been driving to my entire career. I started to understand that the humming truck wasn't just following me. It was calling to me, inviting me to join some endless convoy that traveled roads between worlds, carrying cargo of dreams and memories and forgotten songs. Part of me, a part that grew stronger with each passing mile, wanted to answer that call, to pull over at the next rest area and wait for that phantom rig to appear again so I could flag it down and ask for directions to wherever it was bound. But something deeper, some instinct for self-preservation that had kept me alive through 2 decades of highway driving, told me that answering that call would mean never seeing my home again, never delivering another normal load to a normal destination in the normal world. So I gritted my teeth and kept driving, fighting against the hypnotic pull of that otherworldly melody. I made it to Denver eventually, delivered my load, and collected my pay. But the humming never completely stopped. Even now, months later, I can still hear it sometimes in the quiet moments between gears, in the pause between heartbeats when I'm lying in my bunk at night. It's fainter now, more like a memory than an actual sound, but it's there nonetheless, patient and eternal and waiting. I've started taking different routes, avoiding Highway 50 entirely, but I know it's only a matter of time. The humming truck is still out there somewhere, still following that endless sunset across the desert, still singing its strange and beautiful song. And someday, when the loneliness of the road becomes too much to bear and the call of ordinary destinations loses its power to motivate me, I know I'll turn my rig toward Nevada and go looking for it. Until then, I drive on, carrying my normal loads to my normal destinations, but always listening for that haunting melody that promises journeys to places that exist only in the space between what is and what might be. The humming truck waits for me out there in the desert twilight, and I know that eventually, like every song, this one too will reach its final verse. the Iron Symphony. From Marcus Chen, the Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided 18 wheels through the maze of Oregon's coastal highways, hauling a load of processed lumber, destined for Portland's construction yards. Rain drummed against the windshield in a steady rhythm, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the darkness beyond. The wipers carved their hypnotic arcs across the glass, and the CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers navigating these winding mountain roads in the small hours before dawn. I'd been driving these routes for nearly 15 years, knew every curve and straightaway like the lines on my weathered hands. But tonight something felt different about the familiar landscape rolling past my windows. The fog hung lower than usual, clinging to the valleys between the hills like cotton batting soaked in moonlight, and the usual symphony of night sounds seemed muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. My GPS indicated another 12 miles to the Cascade River Bridge, a towering steel structure that spanned one of the deepest gorges in this part of the state, and I found myself looking forward to crossing it as I always did, enjoying the brief moment when the truck would soar above the churning waters far below. The bridge had been built in the 1940s, a marvel of engineering that connected two sides of a canyon so deep that on foggy nights like this one, you couldn't see the bottom even with the most powerful spotlight. Local truckers had nicknamed it the Iron Giant, and it had become something of a landmark for those of us who regularly hauled freight through this corridor. The structure rose nearly 300 feet above the river. Its steel girders painted a deep green that had faded to almost black over the decades, and crossing it always gave me a sense of accomplishment, as though I were conquering some ancient beast with my modern machine. As I approached the bridge, my headlights cut through the swirling mist and illuminated the first of the massive support towers, their riveted steel surfaces slick with moisture from the fog. The Peterbilt's engine downshifted automatically as we began the slight incline that led onto the span, and I could feel the familiar vibration through the steering wheel as the truck's weight settled onto the bridge's roadway. The sound of my tires changed from the soft whisper of asphalt to the deeper resonance of steel grating, and I rolled down my window slightly to let in the cool night air, breathing in the metallic scent of damp iron and the distant smell of river water far below. But as the truck reached the center of the bridge, something unexpected happened that made me slow down and cock my head to listen more carefully. Beneath the familiar sounds of my engine and the whisper of wind through the steel cables, I could hear something else, something that seemed to rise from the very bones of the bridge itself. It was a low, mournful sound, almost like a human voice stretched thin by pain or longing, and it seemed to vibrate through the metal structure and into the cab of my truck, resonating in my chest like the lowest note of some impossible organ. At first, I thought it might be the wind playing tricks with the bridge's superstructure, creating some kind of harmonic resonance in the cables and girders. But as I continued across the span, the sound grew more distinct, more purposeful, as though the bridge itself were trying to communicate something urgent and desperate. The moaning rose and fell in a pattern that seemed almost musical, though it was unlike any music I had ever heard, filled with an aching sadness that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I pulled the truck to a stop in the center of the bridge, hazard lights blinking orange in the fog, and rolled down both windows to listen more carefully to this strange symphony of steel and sorrow. The sound was definitely coming from the bridge itself, somehow generated by the interaction of wind and metal, but there was something about its rhythm and tone that suggested conscious intent, as though the decades-old structure had developed its own voice and was using it to express some profound grief or warning. I climbed down from the cab, my boots ringing hollow on the steel grating, and walked to the edge of the bridge where a safety barrier prevented vehicles from plunging into the canyon below. The moaning grew louder as I approached the railing, and I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my feet, traveling up through the bridge's framework and into my bones. Leaning over the barrier, I tried to peer down into the mist-shrouded depths of the canyon, but the fog was too thick to see more than a few feet below the bridge's roadway. The moaning seemed to be rising from those hidden depths, as though something in the darkness far below was calling out in wordless anguish, using the bridge's steel structure as a giant resonating chamber to amplify its voice. The sound made my spine tingle with an inexplicable mixture of fear and sympathy, and I found myself wondering what could produce such a haunting cry. What force of nature or remnant of human tragedy might be singing this iron lament into the night? As I stood there listening, the fog began to shift and swirl in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming shapes that my tired mind tried to interpret as faces or reaching hands before they dissolved back into formless vapor. The moaning grew more complex, developing harmonics and overtones that created the illusion of multiple voices joining together in some cosmic dirge, and I realized that my hands were trembling as they gripped the cold metal of the safety barrier. There was something deeply unsettling about the sound, something that spoke to a primal part of my brain and filled me with the urgent need to flee this place as quickly as possible. Walking back to the truck, I noticed that the moaning seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent with each step, as though the bridge were reluctant to let me leave without hearing its complete message. The fog had grown thicker during the few minutes I had spent at the railing, and now it pressed against the truck's windshield like living thing, reducing visibility to mere feet. I climbed back into the cab and put the Peterbilt in gear, but as I began to accelerate across the remaining span of the bridge, the moaning suddenly changed, becoming sharper and more urgent, almost like a warning cry. That's when I saw the lights in my mirrors, two pale orbs that seemed to be following the truck across the bridge, keeping pace despite my increasing speed. They weren't the yellow or white beams of vehicle headlights, but something softer and more ethereal, like moonlight filtered through water or the glow of phosphorescent plankton disturbed in a dark sea. The lights bobbed and weaved behind me, sometimes separating to flank the truck on both sides, sometimes converging to form a single brighter beacon that cast strange shadows across the fog-shrouded roadway. The moaning reached a crescendo as I approached the far end of the bridge, becoming so intense that it seemed to shake the very air inside the cab, and the mysterious lights behind me began to pulse in rhythm with the sound, as though they were somehow connected to whatever force was creating the bridge's mournful voice. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and the diesel engine roared in response, carrying me off the steel span and back onto solid asphalt with a jarring change in sound and vibration that felt like awakening from a disturbing dream. As soon as the truck's wheels touched the regular roadway, the moaning stopped as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch, and the strange lights in my mirrors vanished, leaving me alone with the familiar sounds of engine and tires and the steady drumming of rain on the windshield. I drove for several minutes in stunned silence, my heart gradually slowing from its frantic pace, before I finally reached for the CB radio and called out to any other drivers who might be in the area. The radio crackled with static for a long moment before a gravelly voice responded, identifying himself as a driver named Jake, who was hauling grain about 20 miles ahead of my position. When I asked him about the Cascade River Bridge, whether he had noticed anything unusual when he crossed it, there was a long pause before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of cautious concern that made my blood run cold. He told me that according to his logbook and GPS, he had crossed the Miller Creek Bridge and the Salmon Falls Bridge, but there was no record of him crossing anything called the Cascade River Bridge, and he'd been driving this route for over 20 years without ever seeing such a structure. When I insisted that I had just crossed a massive steel bridge over a deep canyon, Jake's voice grew more puzzled, and he suggested that I might want to pull over and check my maps, because there hadn't been a bridge of that description anywhere along this stretch of highway since the old Cascade span had collapsed during the winter storms of 1987, taking 3 vehicles and their occupants down into the churning waters below. Now, as I write this account at a truck stop 50 miles down the road, I've spent hours studying every map and GPS system I can access. And Jake was right. There is no Cascade River, the freight that rattles back. From Marcus Chen, The thing about driving freight for 23 years is that you learn to read your cargo by sound. Furniture has a dull thud when you take corners. Electronics stay silent and proper. Steel pipes roll and clang like church bells when you hit the brakes too hard. But chains, well, chains have their own language entirely. And the load I picked up that October night in Bakersfield was speaking in tongues I'd never heard before. The manifest said industrial chain, 4,700 pounds of it, bound for a demolition company up in Sacramento. Nothing unusual about that, except for the way old Pete Kowalski kept glancing at his shoes when he handed me the paperwork at the loading dock. Pete had been running freight out of Central California for longer than I'd been alive, and I'd never seen his hand shake while filling out a bill of lading. The fog was rolling in thick off the San Francisco Bay, and by the time I merged onto Highway 99 northbound, my Peterbilt's headlights could barely cut through the gray soup that seemed to press against the windshield like something alive. The engine hummed its familiar rhythm, a deep bass note that I'd grown to find comforting over the years. But tonight it felt different somehow, as if it were trying to drown out something else. That's when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the natural settling of my cargo, the way heavy chains might shift slightly as the truck swayed through gentle curves. But there was a pattern to it, a deliberate quality that made me glance in my side mirrors even though I knew there was nothing to see but fog and the faint glow of my trailer's running lights. The sound came in bursts, like someone was testing the weight of each individual link, running their fingers along the metal with practiced familiarity. I'd driven through plenty of spooky nights over the years. Hell, when you're moving freight across the lonely stretches of interstate at 3 a.m, you get used to your mind playing tricks on you. The way shadows can look like figures standing just outside your headlight beams. The way the radio static sometimes sounds almost like voices calling your name. The way truck stops at 4 a.m. can feel like way station between this world and somewhere else entirely. But this was different. This wasn't my imagination trying to make sense of isolation and exhaustion. This was deliberate, purposeful, and it was coming from inside my trailer. The first rest area I passed was closed for maintenance, orange cones and barriers blocking the entrance like some kind of warning. The second one was so shrouded in fog that I couldn't even make out the building, just the vague suggestion of parking spaces disappearing into gray nothing. So I kept driving, telling myself that I was being ridiculous, that 4,700 pounds of industrial chain couldn't possibly be doing anything except exactly what physics demanded of it. That's when the rattling started. Not the random shifting I'd been hearing, but a rhythmic rattling that seemed to move from the front of the trailer toward the back, then back again, like something was dragging itself along the full 40-foot length of the container. I could feel it through the seat of my pants, a vibration that traveled up through the truck's frame and into my bones. My coffee cup, sitting in its designated holder, began to shake with each pass, the liquid inside forming tiny waves that caught the glow of my instrument panel. I tried turning up the radio, but all I could find were stations fading in and out of static, voices that sounded like they were calling from a great distance, music that kept time with the rattling behind me. Even the CB radio was dead, nothing but white noise that seemed to echo the rhythm coming from my cargo. The highway stretched ahead, empty, except for the occasional pair of taillights disappearing into the fog like red eyes winking shut. Mile markers appeared and vanished in my headlight beams, counting down the distance to Sacramento. But somehow the numbers didn't seem to be getting any smaller. Highway 99 had become a gray tunnel leading nowhere, and I was trapped inside it with whatever was moving around in my trailer. That's when I started to notice that the rattling wasn't random at all. It was responding to me. When I accelerated, it would gather intensity, as if excited by the truck's forward momentum. When I slowed for an off-ramp I ultimately decided not to take, the sound would shift toward the front of the trailer, as if my cargo was trying to peer over my shoulder to see where I was thinking of going. And when I spoke out loud, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, the rattling would pause completely, as if it were listening. By the time I reached the outskirts of Modesto, I was fighting the urge to pull over and take a look inside the trailer. The rational part of my mind knew that opening up a sealed cargo container would mean paperwork and explanations, and probably losing the contract. But the growing certainty that something was very wrong with my freight was making my hands sweat against the steering wheel. Despite the fact that the night air coming through my slightly cracked window was cold enough to fog my breath. The truck stop at Highway 132 appeared out of the fog like a beacon, its neon signs reflecting off the wet asphalt in pools of pink and blue. I pulled into the lot, but instead of heading for the main building, I drove around to the back where the overnight parking was, away from the other trucks and the all-night diner and the bright lights that might attract attention to what I was about to do. The moment I downshifted into park and engaged the air brakes, the rattling stopped completely. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been, a pregnant quiet that made my ears ring. I sat there for several minutes listening to my engine tick as it cooled, watching the fog swirl through the amber glow of the truck stop's security lights. When I finally climbed down from the cab, my boots splashed in puddles I couldn't see until I stepped in them. The fog had turned to a light drizzle that beaded on my jacket and made everything feel slick and uncertain. I walked slowly toward the back of my trailer, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the gray air, illuminating the heavy padlock that secured the cargo doors. I had just reached for the lock when I heard it again, but this time it wasn't coming from inside the trailer. The sound of chains dragging across metal was coming from above me, from the roof of the container, as if something was pulling itself along the surface with deliberate, measured movements. My flashlight beam swept upward, but the fog was too thick to make out anything except the vague outline of my trailer's roof. The dragging sound continued, moving from back to front, then stopping directly above where I was standing. A drop of something that wasn't rain landed on my forehead, warm and sticky, and when I wiped it away with the back of my hand, my skin came away dark in the flashlight beam. That's when I ran. I didn't walk quickly back to the cab or retreat with dignity intact. I ran like a man half my age, splashing through puddles and slipping on the wet asphalt, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I fumbled for the door handle. The Peterbilt's engine turned over immediately, and I had the truck in gear and rolling before I'd even properly settled into my seat. The highway welcomed me back with its familiar rhythm, but now the fog seemed less like a natural weather phenomenon, and more like something that was deliberately trying to keep me from seeing what was happening around me. The rattling in the trailer had resumed the moment I started driving, but now it was faster, more urgent, as if my cargo was agitated by my attempt to investigate. Sacramento couldn't come fast enough, but when I finally reached the demolition company's loading dock at 6:30 in the morning, I discovered that there was no demolition company. The address on my manifest led to an empty lot where a building had recently been torn down. Nothing left but a concrete foundation and a chain-link fence that bore a sign reading, "Future Site of Sunrise Memory Gardens." I sat there in my idling truck for 20 minutes, staring at the empty lot and trying to make sense of what I was supposed to do with 4,700 pounds of industrial chain that apparently had no destination. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the fog, and in the growing daylight everything seemed less threatening, more mundane. Just a truck driver with a delivery problem. Nothing more supernatural than a paperwork error. That's what I told myself as I pulled out my cell phone to call dispatch. But as I scrolled through my contacts looking for the right number, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From inside the trailer came the unmistakable sound of chains being sorted, individual links being tested and arranged with the kind of methodical precision that could only come from intelligent purpose. And underneath that sound, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, I could swear I heard humming. The Comedian in Channel 19. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio crackled to life just as I was hitting the loneliest stretch of Interstate 40 through the Arizona desert, where the highway cuts through nothing but sagebrush and ancient rock formations that look like sleeping giants in the moonlight. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Albuquerque, and the caffeine from my last truck stop coffee was wearing thin. The digital clock on my Peterbilt's dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m., and the only company I had was the steady thrum of my diesel engine and the occasional flutter of moths against my windshield. Breaker 19. Breaker 19. This is Desert Rat looking for a southbound driver, came a voice through the static, smooth and cheerful despite the late hour. Anyone out there got ears on? I reached for the handset, grateful for any distraction from the hypnotic yellow lines disappearing under my hood. Desert Rat, this is Big Jake southbound on the 40, about mile marker 115. Got my ears on. Well, hey there, Big Jake, the voice replied, and I could hear the smile in it. Beautiful night for a drive, ain't it? Listen, I got a joke for you. What do you call a truck driver who delivers to a cemetery? I found myself grinning despite my fatigue. CB humor was usually pretty stale, but there was something infectious about this guy's enthusiasm. I don't know, Desert Rat, what do you call him? A grave hauler? The laughter that followed was genuine and warm, the kind that makes you want to laugh along even if the joke isn't that funny. And honestly, I hadn't heard that one before, which was saying something after 15 years on the road. We chatted for the next 20 miles, Desert Rat regaling me with a steady stream of trucker jokes, each one delivered with perfect timing and that same infectious enthusiasm. The weird thing was, I hadn't heard any of them before. After a decade and a half of listening to CB chatter, you hear every joke in the book at least 50 times. But these were fresh, creative, and surprisingly clever. Here's one for you, Big Jake, Desert Rat said as I passed mile marker 90. What's the difference between a truck driver and a UFO? Lay it on me, as I replied, genuinely curious. The UFO can actually make good time on the interstate. The laughter bubbled through the speaker again, and I found myself chuckling. It was silly, but there was something oddly comforting about having this cheerful companion keeping me company through the dark desert night. As we continued our convoy of conversation, I started paying closer attention to the jokes themselves. They weren't just random trucker humor. They were specifically tailored, touching on experiences that felt deeply personal. Desert Rat told one about a driver who missed his daughter's birthday because of a delayed load in Tucson, and my blood chilled because I'd done exactly that 3 years ago. Another joke referenced a specific truck stop in Flagstaff where the waitress always drew smiley faces on the coffee cups, a detail so obscure I was sure I'd never mentioned it to anyone. Desert Rat, I said during a lull in his comedy routine. Where exactly are you running tonight? I haven't seen any other trucks for the last 30 miles. There was a pause filled only with the soft static of the open channel. Oh, I'm around, Big Jake, just keeping pace with you, friend. Got another one for you. What do you call a driver who talks to himself in the cab? Despite the growing unease in my chest, I played along. What's that? Someone who's finally found an audience that appreciates his stories. The laughter came again, but this time it seemed to stretch a little too long, echoing strangely through the radio speaker. I glanced at my side mirrors, scanning the empty highway behind me. The desert stretched endlessly in both directions, bathed in pale moonlight, but there wasn't another vehicle in sight. No headlights, no taillights, nothing but the ribbon of asphalt disappearing into darkness. Desert Rat, what's your 20? I'm not seeing you out here. Another pause, longer this time. When his voice returned, it carried the same cheerful tone, but underneath it, I detected something else. Something that made the hair on my arm stand up. I'm closer than you think. Big Jake. Hey, want to hear the one about the driver who kept seeing things that weren't there? That's okay, Desert Rat, maybe we should. He kept checking his mirrors. The voice continued, cutting me off. Looking for trucks that should be there but weren't. Listening to voices that seemed to know things they shouldn't know. Funny thing about the road, Big Jake. Sometimes it remembers conversations better than we do. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The jokes had stopped being funny. In fact, as I thought back on them, I realized they'd all shared a common thread. They were about loneliness, isolation, the strange things that happen to drivers on empty highways in the small hours of the morning. Who is this? I asked, my voice sharper now. Just a fellow driver, Big Jake. Been listening to you talk to yourself for the last few hours. You tell some interesting stories when you think nobody's listening. That bit about the accident in Colorado, the one you never reported, classic material. Ice water seemed to flood my veins. I hadn't talked about Colorado. I never talked about Colorado, not on the CB, not to anyone. It was my secret, a moment of inattention and twisted metal that I'd sworn to take to my grave. But as Desert Rat's words sank in, I realized with growing horror that I had been talking, for hours apparently, pouring out confessions and memories into what I thought was an empty channel. The best part, Desert Rat continued, his voice now carrying an undertone of static that sounded almost like whispers, is that you told me the punchlines before I even asked the questions. What do you call a driver who hits a car and drives away? What do you call someone who lies awake every night seeing headlights that aren't there? What do you call a man who's been carrying guilt for 7 years? The CB suddenly erupted with laughter. Not just Desert Rat's warm chuckle, but dozens of voices, a whole chorus of truckers laughing at jokes I apparently told them, punchlines to setups I couldn't remember giving. The sound filled my cab, seeming to come from the speakers, the vents, the very air itself. I grabbed the CB handset and switched to channel 9, then 17, then back to 19, but the laughter followed me to every frequency. My hands shook as I reached for the volume knob, turning it down, but the sound didn't diminish. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. The thing about desert highways, Big Jake, Desert Rat's voice cut through the chorus of laughter, is that they're perfect echo chambers. Sound travels for miles out here, bouncing off rock formations, getting twisted and changed. Sometimes a man's voice can travel so far it ends up talking back to itself. I yanked the CB's power cord from its socket, plunging the radio into darkness. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the drone of my engine and the whisper of wind against the cab. But in that sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the partially open window. Breaker 19, this is Big Jake, and I got a story for you about a time I killed someone and drove away. I slammed on the brakes, my rig jackknifing slightly before coming to a stop on the shoulder. The desert around me was absolutely silent now, but as I sat there in my idling truck, I could swear I heard the distant echo of applause. 2 hours later, as dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, I merged back onto the interstate. I never plugged the CB back in, and I never took that route through Arizona again, but sometimes, on other lonely highways in the deep of night, I'll catch fragments of conversation drifting through my open windows. Truckers telling jokes I swear I've heard before, laughing at punchlines that sound disturbingly familiar, sharing stories that might once have been mine. The Breathing Highway. From Marcus Reed. The fog rolled in like something alive that October night, thick and purposeful as I guided my Kenworth through the mountain passes of northern Oregon. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, knew every curve and grade marker between Portland and Seattle, but I'd never seen fog quite like this. It didn't drift or settle the way weather should. It moved with intention, flowing uphill against the wind, pooling in valleys that should have been clear, reaching across the asphalt like pale fingers testing the warmth of the road. My CB crackled with static as other drivers shared their unease. "Anyone else seeing this soup out here?" came a voice from somewhere ahead. "Visibility's down to maybe 10 feet on the southbound." I keyed my mic and responded, my voice steady despite the creeping sensation that something wasn't quite right about this weather system. The fog seemed to pulse in my headlights, growing denser and thinner in rhythmic waves, almost like breathing. The engine hummed its familiar tune beneath me, a comforting 40,000-pound lullaby that had carried me through countless nights on the road. The dashboard lights cast their green and amber glow across my hands as I gripped the steering wheel, following the barely visible yellow lines that disappeared into the gray wall ahead. My trailer was loaded with electronics bound for Vancouver, scheduled for morning delivery, but I was already running behind thanks to a delayed loading dock back in Sacramento. That's when I noticed the seal around my driver's side window wasn't quite tight anymore. The rubber had grown brittle over the years, and now tiny wisps of fog began seeping through the gap, curling into the cab like curious smoke. At first I welcomed it. The outside air was cool and fresh after hours in the recycled atmosphere of the truck. I reached for the window crank, thinking I'd tighten it up, but something made me pause. The fog entering my cab felt different from the fog outside. Warmer, almost body temperature. And it carried a scent that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Something organic and earthy, like the smell of a greenhouse or the breath of someone who'd been sleeping too long. I told myself it was just the usual mix of pine and mountain air, but my instincts, honed by years of night driving, whispered otherwise. As I continued through the winding mountain road, more fog found its way inside through vents I didn't even know existed. It seeped through the air conditioning system. Despite the fact that I hadn't turned it on, it drifted in around the edges of the windshield where the seal met the frame. Soon, tendrils of the stuff were floating throughout the cab, creating a gray haze that made the familiar interior of my truck feel alien and strange. The radio began picking up signals from farther away, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, weather reports for cities that didn't exist on any map I knew. When I tried to tune back to the trucker channels, I found only static mixed with what sounded like whispered conversations, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to make the hair on my arm stand up. The fog inside the cab grew thicker, and I noticed that my breath wasn't misting the way it should in the cooling air. I pulled my logbook from the door pocket to check my position, and discovered that the pages felt damp, as if they'd been sitting in humid air for hours. The ink from my earlier entries had begun to run, creating dark smears across the regulated grid where I tracked my driving hours. More unsettling was the fact that, according to my last entry, I should have reached the Oregon-Washington border 20 minutes ago, but the mile markers I'd been passing suggested I was still deep in the Oregon mountains. The fog outside began to take on different properties as well. In my mirrors, it reflected the red glow of my taillights in patterns that looked almost like faces, not quite human, but organized enough to trigger that primal recognition that makes you think you're being watched. When I focused on them directly, they dissolved back into random swirls and eddies, but my peripheral vision kept catching those same almost expressions forming and fading in the mist. My truck's computer started acting up around the same time. The GPS showed my location as a blank gray square, and the engine diagnostics flickered between normal readings and impossible numbers. Oil pressure readings that climbed beyond what the system could actually measure, coolant temperatures that dropped below freezing while the engine ran hot. The fog in the cab had grown dense enough that I had to lean forward to see the instruments clearly, and even then, the numbers seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Not my own. I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. Listening to the night sounds of my truck on the mountain road, this was slower, deeper, coming from everywhere at once inside the cab. The fog itself seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the sound, growing warmer on the inhale, cooler on the exhale. I tried to roll down the windows, but they wouldn't budge. The electric controls clicked uselessly, and the manual backup crank turned without engaging anything. The fog outside pressed against the glass like something solid, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just seeping into my cab. It was being drawn in deliberately, as if the truck itself had become a lung, pulling the strange mist inside with each mechanical breath of the engine. The mile markers stopped making sense entirely. I passed the same sign 3 times, mile 47, Oregon Route 20, even though I was traveling in a straight line without turning around. The road stretched ahead endlessly, and my fuel gauge hadn't moved despite hours of driving. The fog inside the cab had become so thick that I could barely see my own hands on the steering wheel. Yet somehow the road ahead remained just visible enough to follow. I tried my cell phone and found no signal, not even the single bar I usually maintained in these mountains. The screen showed the time as 11:47 p.m., the same time it had displayed when I first noticed the fog entering the cab. My watch had stopped as well, its hands frozen at the exact same moment. Time itself seemed to have become as thick and sluggish as the mist that now filled every corner of my truck. The breathing sounds grew louder, more distinct, and I began to make out other sounds within them, whispers in that same unidentifiable language I'd heard on the radio, the soft rustle of movement, the wet sound of something large shifting position. The fog began to coalesce into denser patches, creating shadows that moved independently of my headlights, shapes that suggested the presence of something vast and patient, sharing the confined space of my cab. Then, without warning, a patch of fog directly in front of me began to thin, revealing what looked like an eye the size of a dinner plate, pale and unblinking, watching me with an intelligence that was definitely not human. I jerked the wheel instinctively and the truck lurched toward the guardrail before I regained control. When I looked again, the eye was gone, but the sensation of being observed remained, stronger than ever. My CB suddenly crackled to life with my own voice, reporting my position and asking about road conditions ahead. But I wasn't speaking, my mouth was closed, my hands gripping the wheel. The voice was mine, but the words were coming from somewhere else. Someone else using my voice to communicate with other drivers, giving them information about routes and weather that I had never observed. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Not headlights, but the warm yellow glow of a truck stop. Impossible in this empty stretch of mountain highway, but real enough to navigate toward. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach other people, other drivers who might help me understand what was happening. The fog inside the cab began to swirl more violently, as if agitated by my change in direction, and the breathing sounds became urgent, almost panicked. As I pulled into the truck stop parking lot, the fog suddenly rushed out of my cab through every opening, windows that had been sealed shut, vents that had been closed even through the solid metal of the doors themselves. Within seconds, the interior of my truck was clear, and I could see the familiar diner and fuel pumps of a rest stop I'd used dozens of times before. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. The other trucks in the lot looked normal, their drivers probably sleeping in their bunks or grabbing coffee inside. My logbook was dry again, the ink clear and readable, showing my proper arrival time at the scheduled stop. My watch ticked steadily, and my GPS displayed my correct location along the route. But when I stepped down from the cab to fuel up, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I reached for the diesel nozzle. There in the fog that still clung to the edges of the parking lot were dozens of trucks. Older models, rusted and weathered, with license plates from decades past. Their windshields were dark, but in several of them I could see the silhouettes of drivers still sitting behind their wheels, motionless and patient. The mile that bends around you. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving an 18-wheeler across the country is that after 23 years, you start to know roads like old lovers. Every curve, every hill, every stretch where the pavement turns from black to gray has a memory attached to it. That's why when I found myself on a mile of highway I'd never seen before, somewhere between Barstow and Needles on a route I'd driven maybe 300 times, the wrongness of it hit me like ice water in my veins. It was just past 2 in the morning, that dead hour when the desert stretches endlessly in all directions, and your headlights feel like the only light left in the world. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby, diesel fumes mixing with the dry California air that leaked through the cab's weather stripping. The radio had given up miles back, leaving nothing but static that sounded like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't quite catch. I'd been making good time from Phoenix, my trailer loaded with electronics bound for Los Angeles, when the road simply became something else. I noticed it first as a gentle curve to the left, where there should have been a straight shot through the Mojave. The highway bent lazily, almost gracefully past a cluster of Joshua trees that stood like scarecrows against the star-drunk sky. My CB radio crackled with distant trucker chatter, Voices talking about roadwork and way stations. Normal things that felt suddenly foreign. The speedometer read 73, same as always. But something about the way the yellow line disappeared into my headlight beam made time feel thick as honey. The curve continued longer than it should have. A mile-long arc that twisted through landscape I couldn't place. Rock formations rose on either side like sleeping giants, their surfaces smooth and strange in the darkness. My mirrors showed empty road behind me, but the reflections seemed to shimmer as if the asphalt was water disturbed by an unseen hand. The air conditioning wheezed, pushing stale air through the vents. And I caught a scent that didn't belong, something sweet and organic, like flowers left too long in a closed room. That's when I saw the signs. Not road signs, but marks carved into the stone walls flanking the highway. They looked ancient, spiral patterns and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. My eyes wanted to follow the lines, trace their endless loops, but every time I tried, my vision blurred and my head began to pound. The carved symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, or maybe my heart was matching their rhythm. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the worn leather covering. The miles stretched on, impossibly long now, the curve completing what felt like a full circle, yet somehow I was still moving forward. Outside my passenger window, the desert floor began to show lights, tiny pinpricks of illumination that moved in slow, hypnotic patterns. They danced like fireflies, except fireflies don't exist in the Mojave, and these lights burned with colors that had no names. Purple, green, blue, orange, shades that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. The engine's rumble deepened as if the truck itself was struggling against something I couldn't see. My fuel gauge read 3/4 full, exactly what it had shown when I'd entered the curve, though I'd been driving for what felt like hours. The digital clock on the dashboard flickered between 2:17 and 2:18, the numbers refusing to advance. Time had become elastic here, stretching and contracting like breathing. The CB radio whispered in languages that predated human speech, frequencies that reached into places trucks weren't meant to go. The sweet smell grew stronger, cloying now, mixed with something metallic that coated the back of my throat. Through the windshield, the road ahead began to shimmer like heat mirages, though the desert night was cold. The yellow lines started to waver, becoming serpentine, as if painted by an unsteady hand, or as if they were moving. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I tried the CB radio, pressing the transmit button with a trembling finger. Breaker 19, this is Roadhound looking for anyone out there. I'm on Highway 40 between Barstow and Needles, and I've got a situation here. Static answered, but within the white noise I heard something that might have been my own voice, distorted and echoing, calling back from some impossible distance. The transmission seemed to loop, bouncing off invisible obstacles, creating a chorus of my own fear. The curve began to tighten, banking at an angle that defied the laws of physics. My trailer should have jackknifed. The load should have shifted, but somehow the truck held its line as if guided by forces beyond my control. The stone walls closed in, covered now with symbols that writhed and changed, telling stories in a script that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something primal and terrified deep in my brainstem. That's when I understood the truth of the mile. It wasn't bending around the landscape. It was bending around me. The road had somehow wrapped itself around my presence, creating a loop with me at its center. Every mile marker I passed showed the same number, 247. Every curve revealed the same impossible vista. I was trapped in a single mile of highway that existed in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between thought and action. The dancing lights outside my windows began to press closer, leaving trails of color that lingered in my peripheral vision. They moved with purpose now, intelligence, forming patterns that suggested communication or perhaps interrogation. The sweet smell became overwhelming, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from me, from my skin, as if something was drawing the life out of my pores like nectar from a flower. My reflection in the side mirror started to lag behind my movements, creating a delay that grew longer with each passing moment. When I turned my head left, my reflection turned right. When I lifted my hand from the wheel, my reflected hand gripped tighter. We were becoming separate entities, my mirror self and I, divided by the strange physics of this impossible mile. The engine began to sputter, though the fuel gauge still read 3/4 full. The truck was dying, or perhaps being consumed, its mechanical soul feeding whatever force had created this pocket of twisted space. I could feel the highway drinking from my life force, using my presence to perpetuate its existence. The mile that bent around me was as much a part of me now as I was of it. With desperate clarity, I realized what I had to do. Fighting every instinct that screamed against it, I closed my eyes and let go of the steering wheel. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I felt the truck drift, felt reality shifting around me like sand in an hourglass. The engine's death rattle became a purr, then a roar, then silence so complete it had weight. When I opened my eyes, I was on straight highway, the familiar stretch between Barstow and Needles, with normal desert on both sides and a normal star-filled sky overhead. The clock read 2:18, advanced by a single minute. The CB radio played Willie Nelson, tinny but reassuring. My hands shook as I reached for my coffee thermos, but the liquid inside had gone cold, and when I held the cup up to the dashboard light, tiny spirals traced themselves in the coffee surface, geometric patterns that looked almost like symbols, almost like a message, almost like a promise that some miles never really end. They just wait for you to come back around. The Shadowless Mile. From Jake Morrison. The sun was beating down merciless and bright at 12:15 that Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed the trailer ahead of me had no shadow on the asphalt. I've been running freight for 23 years, seen my share of odd things on the interstate, but this made me ease my foot off the accelerator and lean forward against my steering wheel, squinting through the glare bouncing off my Peterbilt's hood. The trailer was one of those standard 53-footers, white as fresh paint with no company markings, no dot numbers, nothing to identify the outfit running it, clean as a whistle except for the road dust you'd expect after a few hundred miles. The tractor pulling it looked like a late-model Kenworth, dark blue or maybe black, impossible to tell for sure in that harsh midday light. But what got my attention wasn't the rig itself. It was what should have been underneath it on that sun-baked concrete. Every other vehicle on Interstate 40 was throwing a shadow, dark and sharp against the pale highway. My own truck cast a long rectangle of shade that moved with me like a faithful dog. The sedan in the right lane had its shadow, the pickup ahead of it too. Even the overhead signs stretched their geometric darkness across the roadway. But that white trailer, sitting pretty as you please in the center lane about a quarter mile ahead, might as well have been made of ghost light for all the shadow it cast. I reached for my CB radio and thumbed the talk button. "Hey, any drivers out there see that white trailer northbound on 40-mile marker 247? Kenworth tractor? No company marks?" Static answered me for a long moment before a gravelly voice crackled through. "Yeah, driver, I see him. Been behind that rig for about 30 miles now. What about it? You notice anything strange about it?" I asked, keeping my eyes on that impossibly shadowless rectangle ahead. "Strange how? Looks like any other freight hauler to me." "Why?" I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "Never mind, driver. Safe travels." I hung up the mic and settled back into my seat, but I couldn't shake the wrongness of what I was seeing. The sun was directly overhead now, that perfect noon position where shadows should be short but definite, pooled right beneath whatever cast them. Yet the highway under that trailer looked exactly the same as the highway everywhere else, unmarked by shade. My dispatcher had routed me through this stretch of Arizona desert on a tight schedule, hauling electronics from Phoenix to Flagstaff, and normally I'd be focused on making time. But something about that trailer kept drawing my attention like a splinter in my thumb. I found myself matching its speed, hanging back just far enough to keep it in sight, watching for that shadow that never came. The radio crackled again. That you asking about the white trailer, driver? A different voice this time, higher pitched, nervous. That's me. I've been watching that rig too. Passed it about an hour ago, and I swear when I looked in my mirrors it was keeping pace with me even though I was doing 75 and climbing a grade. That Kenworth didn't even seem to be working hard. Where are you now? I asked. Mile marker 265, but I don't see it anymore. Lost sight of it when I stopped for fuel in Winona. Figured it went on ahead. I checked my GPS, mile marker 247. The trailer was still in front of me, still shadowless, but according to the other driver, it should have been 18 miles further north. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill ran down my spine, despite the desert heat baking through my windshield. The highway began to curve gently to the east, and I watched as other vehicles ahead of me took the bend, their shadows shifting and stretching as the angle of the sun changed relative to the road. But that white trailer ahead moved through the curve like it was exempt from the laws of light and physics, never once painting a dark shape on the concrete beneath it. I tried the CB again. Anyone else out there been seeing a white trailer unmarked running with a dark Kenworth? Been holding the center lane for the last hour? Silence stretched for nearly a minute before responses started coming in. Negative on that, driver. Haven't seen any white trailers today. What mile marker you at? I'm running 40 northbound and I don't see what you're talking about. But it was right there in front of me, maybe 200 yards ahead now. I was gaining on it slightly, close enough to make out the license plate mount on the trailer's rear doors, though I couldn't read the actual numbers through the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt. Close enough to see that the trailer's rear lights were dark. No running lights, no marker lights, nothing to indicate it was a working commercial vehicle. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, sagebrush and scattered cacti baking under that relentless sun. No wind moved the sparse vegetation, and the heat created those wavering mirages that made distant mountains look like they were floating above the earth. In all that vastness of light and shadow, dancing heat and sharp-edged rock formations, only that one trailer seemed exempt from the basic rules of how sunlight worked. I was close enough now to see the back doors of the trailer clearly, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. The doors were standing slightly open, maybe 6 inches of gap between them, and through that gap was a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light. Not the ordinary shadow you'd expect inside a cargo trailer, but an absence of illumination so thorough it hurt to look at directly, like staring into a hole cut in the world itself. My CB came alive with chatter from several drivers, all talking at once, but their voices seemed to be coming from very far away. I could make out fragments, mile marker 251, and haven't seen any, and driver, you still there? But the white trailer was pulling ahead of me now even though my speedometer showed I was doing 73, faster than I'd been running all day. The gap in the trailer's rear doors was widening, and that terrible darkness was spilling out like liquid ink, not spreading on the ground but somehow flowing upward, reaching toward the blazing desert sky. I watched in horrified fascination as the darkness began to engulf the entire trailer from back to front, rolling over the white surface like a wave of absolute night. Other vehicles on the highway seemed oblivious to what was happening. A motorcycle passed me in the right lane, the rider's shadow sharp and normal on the asphalt. A family and an SUV drove through the space where the trailer should have been casting its shadow, their children's faces pressed to the windows, seeing nothing unusual. But I could see the darkness spreading forward over the trailer like spilled oil, reaching toward the tractor cab. When the wave of blackness touched the Kenworth, the truck didn't disappear or fade. Instead, it became more real, more solid, more present than anything else on that sun-scorched highway. The details jumped out with painful clarity. Every rivet on the fuel tanks, every scratch on the chrome, every speck of dust on the windshield. And in that windshield, I caught a glimpse of the driver. He was looking back at me in his mirrors, and his eyes were the same absolute darkness that had poured from the trailer. No whites, no pupils. Just that light swallowing black that made my vision blur and my hands shake on the steering wheel. His mouth was moving like he was talking, maybe on a CB radio, maybe to himself. I reached for my own radio with trembling fingers. "Driver in the dark, Kenworth, this is the Peterbilt behind you. Do you copy?" The response came not through the radio, but from everywhere at once. A voice that seemed to originate from the desert itself, from the heat shimmer and the endless sky and the asphalt beneath my wheels. "We've been waiting for you to see us, Jake Morrison. Mile marker 247 every day at noon." I hadn't given him my name. My CB handle was Desert Dog, had been for 15 years, and my actual name wasn't painted anywhere on my truck. But he knew it, just like he knew I'd been seeing what others couldn't see. The darkness had completely enveloped the Kenworth now, and both tractor and trailer were beginning to fade, not disappearing but sinking somehow, descending through the surface of the highway like it was made of water instead of concrete and asphalt. My speedometer showed 85, but I wasn't gaining on them anymore. They were pulling away, sinking deeper, until only the top of the trailer was visible above the roadway. I grabbed my CB mic. "Anyone out there, emergency, emergency, there's something wrong on 40 northbound mile marker 247, do you copy?" Static answered me, then a familiar gravelly voice. "The mist that remembers." From Jake Sullivan, the fog started rolling out of my dashboard vents somewhere between mile marker 347 and the town of Bellwether. A thin wisp at first that I mistook for steam from my coffee thermos. I'd been driving the same route for 8 years, hauling auto parts from Detroit to smaller towns scattered across the Rust Belt, and my 2018 Peterbilt had never given me trouble like this before. The heater had been working fine when I'd started my shift at sunset, pushing warm air through the cab as October's chill settled over the highways like a heavy blanket. I reached over to adjust the climate controls, thinking maybe the temperature differential was causing some kind of condensation, but the fog kept coming, seeping out in delicate tendrils that caught the green glow of my instrument panel. It didn't smell like antifreeze or burning electronics, the usual culprits when something goes wrong under the hood. Instead, it carried a strange, almost sweet scent like morning dew on grass or the air just before a thunderstorm rolls in. The fog seemed to have weight to it, settling low in my cab rather than dissipating the way normal vapor should. The highway stretched ahead of me in the darkness, my headlights cutting through the night and illuminating the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered farmhouses. I'd driven this stretch so many times I could navigate it in my sleep, knowing every curve and elevation change by heart. But tonight something felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The radio station seemed to fade in and out more than usual, and I found myself straining to see beyond the reach of my high beams, as if the darkness itself had grown thicker. The fog from the dashboard continued to build, now flowing in steady streams from every vent in the cab. I tried turning off the climate control entirely, but it made no difference. The wisps continued to pour forth, beginning to fill the lower portion of my cab with a soft, gray mist that moved with an almost deliberate purpose. I cracked the windows, thinking the outside air might help clear it out, but the fog seemed to resist the cross breeze, maintaining its presence no matter what I did. As I crested a hill about 10 miles outside of Bellwether, I noticed that the fog had begun to take on a peculiar quality. Within its swirling depths I could make out what looked like shapes, fleeting images that appeared and vanished so quickly I couldn't be sure I was really seeing them. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the result of too many hours on the road and too much caffeine. But as I watched more carefully, the shapes became more distinct, more purposeful in their movements. There was something that looked like a small figure no bigger than my thumb walking through the mist. Then another, and another, until it seemed like an entire miniature world was taking shape within the confines of my cab. The figures moved with purpose, some appearing to carry tiny burdens, others gesturing to one another in what looked like conversation. I found myself leaning closer to get a better look, my foot unconsciously easing off the accelerator as my attention became consumed by this impossible scene unfolding before me. The truck's engine hummed its familiar tune beneath me, the only sound besides the soft whisper of air through the vents and the nearly inaudible murmur of what I was beginning to realize might be voices. Tiny voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand but that somehow felt familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood. The fog continued to thicken, and within it, the miniature world grew more complex and detailed. I could see what appeared to be tiny buildings now, translucent structures that seemed to be constructed from the mist itself. Streets and pathways wound between them, and along these routes more of the small figures moved with increasing urgency. Some carried bundles on their backs. Others pulled what looked like carts or wagons. It was as if an entire civilization had sprung to life within the fog, a complete society existing in the space between my dashboard and windshield. The voices grew slightly louder, and I found myself straining to make out individual words, though they remained just beyond the edge of comprehension. There was something pleading in their tone, an urgency that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. The figures in the mist seemed to be looking up at me now, their faces barely visible but turned in my direction as if they were trying to communicate something important. I realized I had slowed to well below the speed limit, other trucks passing me with their horns blaring warnings about my reduced pace, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the scene unfolding in my cab. The fog had grown so thick now that it reached nearly to the level of my steering wheel, and within it the tiny world had expanded to fill the entire space. I could see what looked like a town square, with buildings arranged around a central area where many of the figures had gathered. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the gathering there was a structure that looked remarkably familiar. It was shaped like a truck, a perfect miniature replica of an 18-wheeler, but constructed from the same translucent mist as everything else in this strange realm. The tiny figures were moving around it in what appeared to be some kind of ceremony, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic patterns that sounded almost like chanting. As I watched, transfixed, one of the figures climbed up onto the miniature truck and began gesturing toward me. The chanting grew louder, and suddenly I could understand fragments of what they were saying. Words about journeys and travelers, about those who spend their lives on the road between one place and another. They spoke of loneliness and the spaces between destinations, of the liminal existence of those who belong neither here nor there, but always somewhere in between. The figure on the truck was pointing at me now, its tiny voice rising above the others, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just performing some abstract ceremony. They were talking about me, about my life spent traveling these endless highways, about the way I existed in the margins between towns and cities, never quite belonging anywhere but always moving through spaces that others called home. The fog began to pulse with a soft, internal light, and the voices grew insistent, almost desperate. The figures in the mist were reaching upward now, their tiny hands stretched toward me as if they were trying to pull me down into their world. The miniature truck in their town square began to glow more brightly, and I could see that there was a tiny figure sitting in its cab, a figure that looked disturbingly like me. I tried to wave my hand through the fog to disperse it, but my fingers met with unexpected resistance. As if the mist had developed a strange density, the tiny figures scattered at my approach, their voices rising in alarm. But they quickly regrouped and began their chanting again, more urgently than before. The light from their miniature truck grew brighter, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw me downward into their realm. Panic finally overrode my fascination, and I yanked hard on the steering wheel, pulling over to the shoulder of the highway with a screech of brakes and the sharp smell of burning rubber. I threw the truck into park and reached for the door handle, desperate to get out of the cab and away from whatever was happening in the fog. But as my hand touched the metal, the voices in the mist rose to a crescendo, and the pulling sensation became so strong that I felt myself being drawn inexorably downward. With an effort that felt like it might tear me in half, I lunged for the door and tumbled out onto the asphalt, gasping in the cold night air. Behind me, I could hear the voices from the fog calling out, their tone shifting from urgent to almost mournful. I stayed outside for several minutes, pacing alongside my truck and trying to process what I had experienced. When I finally worked up the courage to look back into the cab, the fog was gone. The vents were silent, the dashboard clear, and everything appeared perfectly normal. But there was something different about the air inside, a quality I couldn't quite define, as if the space itself remembered what had happened. I completed my delivery to Bellwether and drove home the next morning. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about those tiny figures in their miniature world. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night on familiar stretches of highway, I find myself checking the dashboard vents, watching for the first wisps of that strange, sweet-smelling fog. Part of me hopes never to see it again, but another part, a part I'm reluctant to acknowledge, finds itself almost looking forward to the next time those tiny voices call out from the mist. Speaking of journeys and the spaces in between, of travelers who exist forever on the margins of other people's destinations, the wind reads letters and numbers. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving the northern routes in late October is that the wind never stops talking. I've been hauling freight through the Canadian borderlands for going on 15 years now, and I've learned to read the language of gusts and whispers that sweep down from the tundra. Most nights it's just white noise, the steady conversation between my 18-wheeler and the endless stretch of asphalt. But 3 weeks ago, somewhere between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg, the wind started speaking in a voice I'd never heard before. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something peculiar. The autumn air had turned sharp and restless, sending waves of dried leaves across Highway 17 like scattered thoughts. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar tune, the diesel engine purring with the steady rhythm that had lulled me through 1,000 lonely nights. The radio played soft country ballads, and the dashboard lights cast their warm amber glow across my weathered hands. Everything felt normal, comfortable even, until I passed that first car pulled over on the shoulder. The vehicle sat dark and abandoned, hazard lights blinking in slow, hypnotic pulses. Nothing unusual about that. Cars break down all the time on these remote stretches. But as my headlights swept across its rear end, illuminating the license plate, I heard something that made me ease off the accelerator. The wind, which had been rushing past my cab windows with its usual wordless howl, seemed to pause and then whisper something that sounded distinctly like letters and numbers. For a J, 7, 4, 9, 2. I glanced in my side mirror at the retreating taillights and felt a cold finger of unease trace down my spine. BCJ 7492. Those were exactly the characters I'd glimpsed on the abandoned car's plate. The wind had spoken them as clearly as if someone were sitting in my passenger seat, reading them aloud in a voice like rustling paper. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on my mind. 3 days on the road will do that to a man. The brain starts making connections that aren't there, hearing patterns in random noise. I turned up the radio and pressed on through the darkness, watching the yellow center line disappear beneath my bumper in an endless stream. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time it was a pickup truck parked at a closed rest stop, sitting beneath a flickering sodium light that painted everything in sickly yellow. As I downshifted to navigate the gentle curve, my headlights caught the rear of the vehicle for just a moment. The wind rose to a sudden crescendo, and in its voice I heard MNT 8850. The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself were reading the plate aloud. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. MNT 8850. I was certain those were the exact characters I'd seen, though the glimpse had been so brief, I shouldn't have been able to make them out clearly. Yet somehow the wind had spelled them out, for me with perfect clarity. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through ice storms and mechanical failures and all the other hazards of the road, insisted this was just coincidence. Maybe stress, maybe too much coffee, Maybe the weird acoustics of wind flowing around my cab were creating auditory pareidolia, making me hear speech in what was only noise. But as the miles rolled by and the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the air around me. The third incident came an hour later, and this time there was no denying what I heard. A sedan sat in the parking lot of a shuttered gas station, positioned beneath a dead neon sign that had once advertised 24-hour service. The building looked like it had been abandoned for months, maybe years, with plywood covering the windows and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But the car was newer, clean, as if it had just been parked there. As I passed, the wind died completely for a moment, an eerie stillness that made my ears ring, and then rose in a voice that was unmistakably deliberate. Juanpi, 3116. I pulled over at the next safe spot, a wide shoulder beside a guardrail that overlooked a dark valley filled with sleeping pines. My hands were shaking as I reached for my logbook, and I had to try twice before I managed to click on the dome light. In the margin of today's page, I wrote down the 3 license plates the wind had whispered: BCJ 7492, MNT 8850, ONP 31-16. Staring at those combinations of letters and numbers, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. They looked ordinary enough, just random provincial plates from Manitoba and Ontario. But something about seeing them written down made them feel significant, weighted with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I tried calling my dispatcher on the CB radio, thinking I'd report the abandoned vehicles in case someone needed assistance, but all I got was static. The kind of deep, empty white noise that means you're too far from civilization for the signals to reach. The isolation pressed in around me like a living thing, and I suddenly became acutely aware of how alone I was on this stretch of highway. Starting the engine again, I pulled back onto the road and tried to focus on the familiar routines of driving. Check the mirrors, monitor the gauges, watch for deer, but the wind had changed now. Instead of the random gusts and eddies I knew so well, it had developed a rhythm, a cadence that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. Long inhalations that made the trees beside the highway sway in unison, followed by slow exhalations that sent leaves skittering across my windshield like tiny hands scratching at the glass. The 4th license plate appeared just as I was beginning to hope the strange experience was over. This one belonged to a minivan parked beside a rural mailbox, positioned as if the driver had stopped to check for letters and never returned. The vehicle's sliding door hung partially open, revealing dark interior spaces that seemed to swallow my headlight beams. As I passed, the wind rose in its now familiar whisper: SAK 9703, SAK 9703. I added it to my growing list, and as I wrote the characters, I noticed my handwriting was becoming increasingly unsteady. The pen kept slipping in my sweaty palm, and the letters looked jagged, desperate. By the time I encountered the 5th abandoned car, pull over beside a lonely intersection marked only by a stop sign riddled with bullet holes, I was no longer surprised to hear the wind recite its license plate, 4YX8921. What surprised me was the realization that I was beginning to anticipate the whispers, to lean forward and listen carefully as my headlights swept across each new vehicle. It was then that I noticed something else. Each of the abandoned cars was positioned in such a way that their license plates were clearly visible from the road, not parked haphazardly or at angles that might obscure the numbers, but carefully positioned for maximum visibility, as if someone had arranged them specifically to be read by passing traffic. The thought sent ice water through my veins. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to reach the next town, the next truck stop, anywhere with lights and people and the blessed noise of human activity. But the highway stretched on endlessly, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through wilderness that seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive with each passing mile. The wind was constant now, no longer rising and falling but maintaining a steady pressure against my cab. And in that pressure, I began to hear something new. Not just the whispered recitation of license plates, but what sounded like dozens of voices murmuring in unison, as if a crowd of people were walking alongside my truck, keeping pace with my 70-mile-per-hour progress and talking among themselves in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't make out individual words, but the collective whisper had a pleading quality that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. It reminded me of the sound my grandfather's radio used to make late at night, when he'd tune between stations and catch fragments of distant broadcasts, voices from far away, speaking words that were almost but not quite understandable. The sixth abandoned vehicle was different from the others. Instead of a car or truck, it was a motorcycle, a sleek touring bike that had been carefully parked beside a historical marker I couldn't read in the darkness. The bike's chrome caught my headlights and threw the reflection back like a signal mirror, and as I passed, the wind's whisper came louder than before. TRM 2 4 8 7 TRM 2487. As I wrote it down, I realized the list now contained 6 license plate numbers, and something about that count felt significant, not complete, but approaching completion, like a combination lock that was missing only, the freight that never stops bleeding. From Eddie Martinez. The thing about long-haul trucking is that you learn to trust your instincts, and my instincts were screaming at me to walk away from that delivery contract the moment I saw it posted on the board at the Flying J just outside of Amarillo. The pay was too good, double what any legitimate cargo should fetch for a straight shot from Texas to Portland, and the pickup location was listed simply as mile marker 247, Highway 287 North, midnight sharp. But I'd been driving on fumes and instant coffee for 3 weeks straight, barely scraping together enough to keep my rig running, so when desperation whispers louder than common sense, you tend to listen. The October wind carried the scent of dying mesquite and distant rain as I guided my Peterbilt down the darkened highway, headlights cutting through the thick Texas night like twin swords through black velvet. The radio crackled with static and fragments of late-night talk shows, voices discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena that seemed oddly fitting for the unease settling in my chest. Mile marker 247 appeared in my headlights exactly at midnight, and there, pulled off onto a gravel access road, sat a white panel van with its hazard lights blinking in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The man who emerged from the van moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to conducting business in shadows. He was thin, wearing a pressed suit that seemed impractical for a roadside cargo transfer, and his pale hands gestured toward the back of his vehicle with an almost ceremonial formality. The cargo itself was unremarkable at first glance. A single wooden crate, roughly the size of a coffin, secured with heavy metal bands and marked only with symbols that looked vaguely medical in nature, though I couldn't quite place their meaning. "Handle with extreme care," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't identify. Something European, perhaps refined and old world. The contents are delicate, temperature sensitive. There can be no delays, no stops except for fuel. You understand the importance of maintaining the cold chain? I nodded, though something about the way he emphasized those words sent a chill crawling up my spine. The crate was surprisingly heavy, requiring both of us to maneuver it into my refrigerated trailer. And as we secured it with tie-down straps, I noticed dark stains on the wooden slats, old stains that had seeped deep into the grain. The man handed me an envelope thick with cash and a sealed packet containing what I assumed were delivery instructions. The recipient will be waiting at the Portland Fish Market, Pier 7 before dawn. Do not open the cargo bay until you arrive. Do not investigate any sounds you might hear. And whatever you do, do not let the refrigeration unit fail. His pale eyes met mine in the dim glow of my trailer's interior lights, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something like pity flickering there. Then he was gone, disappearing into his van and driving away into the night, leaving me alone with my mysterious cargo and a growing sense that I'd just made a terrible mistake. The first few hours passed without incident as I rolled north through Texas and into Oklahoma, the steady hum of the refrigeration unit providing a familiar mechanical lullaby. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, as I crossed into Kansas under a sky heavy with storm clouds, I began to hear something else beneath the drone of cooling fans and engine noise. It started as a soft dripping sound, barely audible above the ambient noise of the highway, like rain on leaves or water from a leaky faucet. I tried to dismiss it as condensation from the cooling system, a normal byproduct of maintaining low temperatures in humid air. But the sound grew more pronounced as the miles rolled past, developing a rhythm that seemed almost organic, like a slow heartbeat or steady breathing. During a fuel stop outside of Wichita, I walked around to the back of my trailer, pressing my ear against the cold metal doors. The dripping was definitely coming from inside, accompanied now by what sounded disturbingly like wet sliding movements, as if something was shifting around in there. The logical part of my mind suggested that whatever was in that crate was thawing despite the refrigeration, but logic felt increasingly inadequate as the night wore on. The storm that had been threatening finally broke as I crossed into Nebraska, unleashing sheets of rain that hammered my windshield and turned the highway into a river of reflected neon and taillights. The sound of the downpour should have masked whatever was happening in my trailer, but instead it seemed to amplify it, creating a symphony of dripping that came from both inside and outside my cab. Every few miles I found myself glancing in my side mirrors, expecting to see something dark and viscous trailing behind my rig like a breadcrumb trail of nightmares. Near dawn, as I rolled through the outskirts of Denver with the Rocky Mountains looming like sleeping giants in the distance, the refrigeration unit began to struggle. The temperature gauge flickered between normal and warning levels, and I could hear the compressor working harder, cycling on and off with increasing frequency. The dripping sound from the trailer had evolved into something that sounded unmistakably like flowing liquid, as if someone had opened a faucet back there and left it running. When I stopped for fuel and a mandatory rest break, I noticed dark spots on the pavement behind my trailer, stains that glistened wetly in the harsh fluorescent light of the truck stop. The maintenance bay at the truck stop was staffed by a grizzled mechanic named Pete, who'd probably seen every mechanical problem imaginable during his decades working on long-haul rigs. But when he popped the hood on my refrigeration unit and began checking the coolant levels and electrical connections, his weathered face creased into a frown of confusion. "Everything looks fine," he said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Temperature readings are normal, coolant levels good, compressors running smooth. But I'll tell you what, Eddie, there's something leaking from your trailer and it ain't coolant. You might want to check your cargo." Standing at the back doors of my trailer, key in hand, I felt the weight of that strange man's warning echo in my memory. "Do not open the cargo bay until you arrive. Do not investigate any sounds you might hear." But the dark stains spreading across the asphalt beneath my rig were impossible to ignore, and the smell that had begun to emanate from the trailer was unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of hauling everything from livestock to medical supplies. It was metallic and organic at the same time, like pennies left too long in warm water, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach clench. The sound of my key turning in the lock seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness, and as the doors swung open, releasing a cloud of frigid air that should have been odorless but carried that strange metallic scent, I saw that the wooden crate had somehow shifted during transport despite being securely tied down. More troubling was the dark pool that had spread across the trailer floor, a viscous liquid that reflected the overhead lights like black mirror. The crate itself appeared to be weeping, with dark rivulets streaming from between the wooden slats and metal bindings, as if whatever was inside was slowly melting or decomposing despite the near-freezing temperature. My hands shaking, I climbed into the trailer for a closer look, careful to avoid stepping in the spreading pool of whatever was leaking from the crate. The smell was overwhelming at close range, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The symbols marking the crate were clearer now, and I recognized them as medical warnings for biohazardous materials. though they were older than any modern labeling system I knew. As I knelt beside the crate, trying to determine the source of the leak, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A soft tapping from inside the wooden box, rhythmic and deliberate like fingers drumming against the interior walls. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping in the dark puddle, and slammed the trailer door shut with hands that trembled so badly I could barely work the lock. Whatever was in that crate was not just leaking, it was active, aware, and very much not the deceased biological specimen I'd assumed I was transporting. The remaining hours of my journey to Portland passed in a haze of mounting dread, with the sounds from my trailer growing increasingly active and the dark stains appearing at every stop despite my best efforts to clean them up. The Portland Fish Market at dawn was a chaos of activity, vendors setting up stalls and fishing boats returning with their overnight catches. But Pier 7 stood eerily empty except for another pale man in an expensive suit who waited beside a refrigerated truck identical to mine. The transfer was quick and efficient, the two men working together to move the still dripping crate from my trailer to theirs with practiced ease. The Gray Mile. For Marcus, the exit sign shouldn't have been there at all, but it was the ash that made me pull over to the shoulder, my 18-wheeler hissing to a stop on the rain-slicked interstate. In 32 years of hauling freight from Seattle to Sacramento, I'd memorized every mile marker, every rest stop, every faded green rectangle that marked civilization's tendrils reaching into the Oregon wilderness. Exit 247 had never existed before tonight, yet there it stood, illuminated by my headlights like some fever dream made manifest. The rain drummed steadily against my windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding down the glass in meandering rivulets. My CB radio crackled with static, the usual chatter from other night haulers reduced to whispers and fragments. The engine of my Peterbilt rumbled beneath me, a comforting vibration that had lulled me through countless midnight runs, but now even that familiar rhythm felt somehow off, syncopated against the storm's percussion. What disturbed me most wasn't the sign's sudden appearance, but its construction, where regulation exit signs bore crisp white lettering on forest green backing. This one displayed crude gray markings that seemed to shift and blur in my headlight's reach. The letters spelling Exit 247 appeared to have been painted with ash, thick and uneven, as though someone had mixed crematorium dust with rainwater and applied it with trembling fingers. Below the exit number, another word had been scrawled in the same ashen paint, but the rain made it impossible to read from my cab. I should have radioed dispatch, should have reported the unauthorized signage to the highway department. Instead, I found myself reaching for the door handle, driven by the same morbid curiosity that makes drivers slow down at accident scenes. The rain struck my face as I climbed down from the cab, cold droplets that tasted faintly of sulfur and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that coated my tongue with oily residue. The asphalt beneath my boots felt wrong, softer than it should be, as though the road surface had been recently disturbed and improperly set. Each step left a deeper impression than physics should have allowed, and when I glanced back at my tracks, they were already filling with dark water that reflected no light. The exit sign loomed above me, its metal post newer than anything the state would have installed, gleaming with moisture that seemed to bead and roll upward rather than down. Up close, the ash-painted letters revealed their true horror. What I had taken for crude brushwork was actually a mixture of ash and something else, something that looked disturbingly like ground bone fragments suspended in the gray paste. The letters themselves seemed to pulse with their own dim luminescence, a phosphorescent quality that reminded me of rotting wood or deep-sea creatures. The word below Exit 247 became legible now, spelled out in the same grisly medium. Ashford. Ashford. The name meant nothing to me, yet it triggered a deep unease that settled in my stomach like spoiled food. I had been driving this route for 3 decades, had watched small towns rise and fall along the interstate's path, but no Ashford had ever appeared on any map or manifest. The exit ramp itself stretched away into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach, its yellow lines painted in the same ash and bone mixture that adorned the sign. Even through the rain, I could see that the pavement bore fresh tire tracks, deep grooves that suggested heavy vehicles had recently used this phantom exit. My radio squawked from the cab behind me, a burst of static followed by a voice that sounded oddly distorted, as though transmitted through water or thick fog. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried an urgency that made my skin crawl. When I turned back toward my truck, I noticed that the rain around my vehicle had taken on a distinctly gray tint, each droplet carrying a fine particulate that left sooty streaks across my trailer's white sides. The CB continued its garbled transmission as I climbed back into the cab, and when I finally made out the words, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The voice, speaking in the measured cadence of a highway patrol dispatcher, was reading off a series of license plate numbers, vehicle descriptions, and last known locations. Every truck described was traveling southbound on Interstate 5 between midnight and dawn. Every license plate belonged to an owner who had been reported missing in the past 6 months. My own license number came through the static with crystal clarity. I grabbed the handset with shaking fingers, pressing the talk button so hard that plastic creaked under the strain. "Dispatch, this is Marcus Holloway, Unit 779er. I'm not missing, I'm right here on I-5 southbound, mile marker." Mile marker? I released the button and stared at my GPS display, watching the screen flicker between positions as though it couldn't decide where I was. The device showed my location jumping erratically between coordinates that placed me hundreds of miles apart, sometimes positioning me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, sometimes deep underground. The voice on the radio continued its litany of vanished truckers, each description matching a vague memory of CB conversations from nights past, handles I had heard and forgotten, voices that had simply stopped participating in the endless chatter that connected night drivers across the lonely miles. How many of those silences had I attributed to radio problems or route changes? How many missing persons reports had been filed by families who would never know what happened to their loved ones on the Gray Mile? Through my windshield, the ash-painted sign continued to glow with its sickly phosphorescence, and I could see now that the exit ramp's yellow lines pulsed in rhythm with the letters, as though the entire installation shared some malevolent heartbeat. Other signs began to appear in my peripheral vision, reflective markers that hadn't been there moments before, all bearing the same ashen script. Mile markers that counted down in reverse, warning signs that made no sense. Brake for phantom load. No CB beyond this point. Way station closed permanently. The rain had thickened to a steady downpour that turned my windshield wipers into metronomes, keeping time with my racing pulse. Every sweep revealed new impossibilities. Other trucks parked along the shoulder, their shapes visible only in the split second between wiper passes, vanishing when I tried to focus on them directly. License plates that belonged to drivers I remembered hearing about on the news. Missing persons cases that had made brief headlines before being forgotten by a world that had no time for mystery. My engine began to sputter, the reliable Caterpillar diesel that had never failed me in over 1,000,000 miles, suddenly protesting as though it were trying to process contaminated fuel. The cab filled with the smell of burning ash and something sweet and cloying that reminded me of funeral flowers left too long in the sun. When I checked my fuel gauge, the needle was dropping with impossible speed. The tank that had been 3/4 full at my last stop now reading nearly empty. The CB radio fell silent with a finality that felt like death itself, the static cutting off so abruptly that my ears rang in the sudden quiet. Only the rain remained, drumming its gray cadence against metal and glass while the ash-painted signs multiplied around me like a forest of warnings written in the language of the crematorium. I could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the exit ramp, silhouettes that might have been abandoned trucks or might have been something else entirely, something that walked upright but moved with the wrong kind of rhythm. I shifted into drive with hands that trembled against the steering wheel, my foot pressing the accelerator as my truck lurched forward through the thickening rain. In my mirrors, the exit sign and its impossible ramp began to fade, dissolving back into the darkness like a mirage in reverse. But the taste of ash remained on my tongue, and the gray stains on my trailer would never wash completely clean, serving as proof that some roads exist only for those who have already lost their way. The radio crackled back to life as I gained distance from exit 247, normal conversations resuming as though nothing had happened. But now I knew what to listen for. The absence that followed certain voices, the handles that would speak once or twice before joining the silence forever. Somewhere behind me in the rain-soaked darkness, that phantom exit continued to collect its toll from night drivers who pulled over to investigate the impossible, marking each addition to its ghostly roster in ash and bone. I drive past that stretch of highway differently now, eyes fixed firmly forward, radio turned low, refusing to acknowledge the gray shimmer that sometimes appears at the edge of my vision when the rain falls hard and the night grows especially dark. The smiling passenger, from Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale moonlight, and I'd been driving for nearly 12 hours straight when I spotted her standing beside the broken guardrail at mile marker 247. My CB radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, and the diesel engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar lullaby through the cab as I downshifted and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. The woman stood perfectly still in the wash of my headlights, wearing a simple blue dress that seemed oddly clean for someone stranded on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, Montana. She raised her hand in a polite wave, and even from 50 feet away I could see she was smiling. Not the relieved smile of someone grateful for rescue, but something constant and serene that seemed painted across her features. The CB crackled again with empty static as I set the air brake and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the loose gravel. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, with that peculiar stillness that comes to the high plains after midnight. "Evening, miss," I called out, keeping a respectful distance. "Looks like you might need some assistance." She turned toward me with that same unchanging smile, her eyes reflecting my truck's running lights like small mirrors. Her hair was dark and shoulder length, perfectly styled despite being stranded roadside, and her skin had an almost porcelain quality in the artificial light. "I would be very grateful for a ride," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. European perhaps, or maybe just the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English wasn't their first language. My car broke down several miles back and I've been walking for quite some time. I glanced around but saw no sign of another vehicle. No tire tracks in the soft earth beside the guardrail. No scattered debris or oil stains that might indicate where a car had pulled over. The company had strict policies about picking up hitchhikers, but something about her demeanor seemed harmless enough, and the nearest town was still 40 miles ahead. "I suppose I could give you a lift to Millfield," I said, already knowing I'd made my decision. "There's a truck stop there with a phone, and maybe someone who can help you with your car situation." She nodded graciously, that smile never wavering, and followed me to the passenger side of the truck. I helped her up into the cab, noting how remarkably light she seemed, almost weightless as she stepped up onto the running board. Her dress remained pristine despite the dust and gravel, and she settled into the passenger seat with an unusual stillness, her hands folded in her lap and her back perfectly straight. As we pulled back onto the highway, I tried making conversation the way I always did with passengers. "Name's Marcus," I said, shifting through the gears as we gathered speed. "Been running this route for about 8 years now. What brings you out to this part of the country?" She turned to look at me and that smile seemed to grow just slightly wider. "I'm traveling," she said simply. "I go wherever I'm needed." There was something about the way she said it that made the hair on my arm stand up, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. Maybe it was the lack of inflection in her voice or the way she continued staring at me, even after she'd finished speaking. I nodded and tried to focus on the road, but I could feel her eyes on me constantly. The miles passed in relative silence, broken only by the steady rumble of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind against the cab. I kept glancing at her in my peripheral vision, and each time her expression remained exactly the same. That serene, constant smile never flickered, never changed, as if it were carved from stone. Her eyes didn't seem to blink as often as they should, and she sat with such perfect posture that she might have been a mannequin positioned in the seat. "So where exactly did your car break down?" I asked, trying to break the uncomfortable quiet that had settled between us. I didn't see any vehicles back there, or any tracks leading off the highway. She tilted her head slightly, like a bird considering a particularly interesting insect. "It was quite far from the road," she replied, and again that smile seemed to stretch just a fraction wider. "Sometimes these things happen in the most unexpected places." Her answer didn't really address my question, and something about her tone suggested she found my curiosity amusing in a way I couldn't understand. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m., and the highway remained completely empty in both directions. No other headlights broke the darkness ahead or behind us, and even the CB radio had fallen silent. The isolation of the high plains pressed against the windows like something alive, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My passenger continued to sit in perfect stillness, her hands never moving from their folded position, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. "Are you feeling all right, miss?" I asked, genuinely concerned now. "You've been sitting mighty still there. Would you like me to adjust the heat or crack a window?" She turned to face me fully, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, her smile looked almost luminescent. "I'm perfectly comfortable," she said, and her voice seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "This is exactly where I need to be." The way she emphasized the word "need" sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the door seals. As we crested a small hill, the lights of Millfield became visible in the distance, scattered like fallen stars across the valley floor. I felt a wave of relief at the sight, though I couldn't have explained why. The idea of reaching civilization, of having other people around, suddenly seemed very important. "There's the town," I said, pointing ahead. "Won't be long now." My passenger followed my gesture and nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, and for the first time since I'd picked her up, her smile seemed to falter slightly. I can see it quite clearly. There was something in her tone that suggested disappointment, though again I couldn't fathom why anyone wouldn't be pleased to reach safety after being stranded. The first buildings of Millfield began to appear along the roadside, dark houses and closed businesses that looked almost abandoned in the pre-dawn hours. The truck stop sat at the far end of town, its neon signs casting pools of blue and red light across the empty parking lot. As I downshifted and prepared to turn into the lot, I noticed my passenger had begun to shift slightly in her seat, her perfect posture finally showing signs of movement. "This will do perfectly," I said, pulling up beside the main building. "They'll have a phone inside, and Jerry, who runs the place, knows everyone in town. He'll be able to help you figure out what to do about your car." I set the air brake and turned to face her, expecting to see relief or gratitude in her expression. Instead, her smile had returned in full force, wider than ever before, stretching her features in a way that didn't look quite natural. Her eyes reflected the neon light from outside, but there seemed to be something else glowing behind them, something that belonged to neither the truck stop's signs nor my dashboard lights. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, and the way she spoke my name made it sound like she was tasting something particularly delicious. "You've been exactly what I needed." Before I could ask what she meant, she had moved with impossible speed, her hand touching my shoulder with fingers that felt cold even through my thick flannel shirt. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent a wave of numbness down my arm that spread toward my chest like spilled ice water. Her smile grew impossibly wide, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp in the artificial light. I jerked away from her touch and fumbled for the door handle, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What the hell are you?" I managed to gasp, but when I turned back, The passenger seat was empty. The door on her side hung open, swaying gently in the night breeze, but there was no sign of where she had gone. I sat there for several minutes, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The numbness in my arm gradually faded, leaving behind only the memory of that impossible cold. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to the passenger side, examining the ground for footprints or any other sign of her passage. But the gravel showed only my own tracks from when I'd helped her up hours earlier. Jerry emerged from the truck stop as I stood there searching the shadows, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. "You all right there, Marcus?" he called out. "Saw you pull in, but you've been sitting mighty still." Having truck trouble, I looked up at him, trying to find words that would make sense of what I'd experienced. "Did you see anyone get out of my truck just now?" I asked. "Oh,